In our last lecture, we looked at civil society and evolving modes of civic participation. In this lecture, we turn our attention to China's internationalization and its effects. We will notably look at social organizations going overseas and the attendant effects that they have on host jurisdictions. China's reemergence as an overseas developmental actor can be examined through the prism of a growing number of Chinese non-governmental organizations and government-organized non-governmental organizations, or gongos, working globally. What happens when Chinese NGOs and gongos that are born and socialized in such an authoritarian context are now going out to other jurisdictions with varying regime types and institutional environments? The growth of China's overseas developmental assistance has mirrored the growth of its state-run commercial investments in trade. This is embodied in the going out policy. Much of China's overseas developmental assistance is directed at nations where China has a substantial stake in accessing low-cost human capital and/or the natural resources sector. With such assistance provided largely in the form of concessional or low-interest loans and government-financed or government-subsidized infrastructure projects, little of China's aid to developing nations can be categorized as traditional overseas developmental assistance. Critically, China's developmental assistance is linked to its own national interests and needs. With Beijing an increasingly significant actor in international development, our expectations for structural, institutional, and/or political change in host nations are challenged. Suffice it to say, China's developmental assistance may strengthen existing authoritarian regimes, forestalling democratization in some contexts, and perhaps reversing this process in other jurisdictions. Actors such as non-governmental organizations or gongos also play an intrinsic role in the field of international development. They are agents of export with respect to best practices and worst practices and standard setting. This lecture will examine the role of Chinese non-governmental organizations and gongos in conducting international development and as a potential node for transmitting new developmental practices and as a sort of a case study to understand China's rapid internationalization. Traditionally, NGOs are simultaneously seen by scholars as harbingers of democratic principles, alternative social service providers, and have a capacity-building function. These interactions indicate the importance of training and socializing NGOs in recipient nations. NGOs in present day are predominantly from Western nations, and generally speaking, they teach local NGOs to Western model state-society relations, whereby an NGO acts as a watchdog and sometimes is antagonistic to a non-responsive government. Scholarship in this vein views the NGOs as opponents to the state, with their proliferation as a proxy for future democratization activities. Yet what happens when the NGOs who are doing the teaching have themselves emerge within an entirely different political context and have themselves experience a political education that varies greatly from a Western democratic one? Relatedly, what happens when the organization in question is not strictly an NGO, but a government-organized entity? Chinese social organizations have evolved and developed in an authoritarian institutional context, which sharply contrasts to their Western counterparts. What is particularly different between Chinese gongos and their Western counterparts is that Chinese gongos emerged largely out of the constructs of the state. Chinese gongos were created to shore up government's legitimacy. Now, creating a gongo in one's own image can be part of a larger project to recreate society in the government's image, or making society more legible and more easily governable. Beyond just being a conduit between state and society, they can be used as a safe proving ground wherein the state can test experimental policies. So, for instance, the perceived distance between the government and gongo can insulate the state from negative consequences when such policies go wrong. Similar to how NGOs behave in China, when gongos do well, their ties can be used to credit the government. When they fail, the government can distance itself and insulate the state from criticism. In order to survive and flourish in China's domestic political and institutional environment, Chinese social organizations develop adaptive strategies, which are now being ingrained in their organizational culture and behavior. As they mature, Chinese social organizations are looking beyond their local communities. Indeed, they are even casting their gaze across national borders. Within the broader framework of China's going out policies, Chinese NGOs are starting to impress their presence abroad. In Africa, for example, there are some 100 Chinese social organizations working in the continent. This might be along the likes of China's National Red Cross or the China Foundation for Poverty Alleviation. One of the most important caveats to note is that the 100 social organizations abroad are in fact, for the most part, gongos. From the standpoint of the Chinese state, Chinese social organizations can be seen as facilitating friendly relations. In line with the rise of Chinese investments in Africa, Chinese social organizations are seen by observers as a way to soften China's image abroad, even to the extent of rectifying some of the damages caused by Chinese investment. Here, the role of Chinese social organizations is seen as supplanting the corporate social responsibilities of Chinese firms. Such perspectives suggest that Chinese social organizations have a limited role in actually promoting long-term developmental projects, independent of Chinese commercial interests. There is also, to be sure, a real demand for both developmental assistance and the expertise that NGOs can provide. For example, in the cases of Ethiopia and Malawi, some of the world's poorest nations and least developed, we find that beyond the expectations and rhetoric espoused by Beijing, we don't actually find sustained Chinese social organizations' activities in both nations. Although gongos are effectively agents of the state, they potentially have an important role to play in international development. This was aptly the case when looking at interviews we conducted in Africa. Here, Chinese gongos representatives emphasized their work in promoting cooperation, understanding, and exchanges with their African counterparts. Notwithstanding, it does appear that the reception by host jurisdictions in Africa can be less than rosy, as seen in Ethiopia and Malawi. Gongos such as China NGO Network International Exchange and Beijing NGO Association for International Exchanges see themselves as platforms for promoting cross-cultural learning. As the secretary of China's NGO Network International Exchange noted, the organization is chiefly a networking platform. This was echoed by the Beijing equivalent, whereby the Beijing NGO Association is primarily seen as a networking platform and therefore it cooperates with the largest and most influential local African NGOs. Beyond the sort of networking aspect, we see that many gongos also engage in the delivery of social services. The China Youth Development Foundation and the China Foundation for Poverty Alleviation focus on direct delivery of services. For example, the China Youth Development Foundation, through its China Africa Hope project in Kenya, in Burundi, in Rwanda, aim to build at least 1,000 primary schools in those regions. We've seen that a range of Chinese companies has funded the project in Africa. Moreover, we see that the China Foundation for Poverty Alleviation is focused on building hospitals across Sudan. With a budget of approximately $10 million, the organization aims to build 13 hospitals and to train medical staff and provide equipment to the hospitals. Despite the desire to undertake further projects in Africa, the majority of gongos believe that they don't have sufficient funding to at least have a permanent presence in Africa. There are, of course, practical and theoretical implications to the sort of behavior of Chinese social organizations in Africa. When it comes to the practical implications, the first item to note is that in the most immediate term, there will be more of the status quo. As has been replicated elsewhere in Africa, we will see more one-off temporary entry of Chinese experts or volunteers. A great example of this is in Ethiopia. When I was there in the field, I was informed of the presence of a large team of doctors from the Beijing Eye Hospital who were in the nation to provide social capacity. This basically involved providing short-term surgery for those in need. These temporary, project-based interventions lack any attempt to institutionalize Chinese social organizations, and it's a model that's widely used in the mainland. Second, given Beijing's professed preference for government-to-government linkages in development, this may suggest a more sustained presence between state-to-state interactions without the involvement of NGOs. And if there is going to be involvement of NGOs, it's going to be at the Gongo level. Future Gongo initiatives will have a one-off and ad hoc nature nevertheless. While these one-off projects are easy to control, they do lead to a loss of institutional knowledge, which interestingly enough is witnessed in the domestic Chinese context. The solutions are generally short-term and temporary. Finally, I suspect that there's going to be a Gongoization of development, but this may not be a major barrier for entry into some jurisdictions. While we can acknowledge at first glance Chinese Gongos may not look so different from Western NGOs, especially when considering sources of state NGO funding as a proxy. For example, Swedish and Norwegian NGOs receive up to 35% of their finances from their respective governments. In Belgium and the Irish NGOs, they have up to 3/4 of their funding from government sources. What is qualitatively different between Chinese Gongos and their Western counterparts is the fact that Chinese Gongos emerge largely out of the constraints of an authoritarian state. In order to survive and flourish in China's domestic political and institutional environment, Chinese NGOs and Gongos developed adaptive strategies which are now ingrained in their culture and behavior as they are overseas. From another standpoint, Western NGOs, unlike Chinese social organizations, are generally able to create and implement their organizational goals and strategies. Suffice it to say, if you look at the case of Malawi or Ethiopia, they highlight some critical areas where Chinese social organizations may face entry barriers, but also opportunities to address the developmental needs in both nations. What the findings suggest is that the political regime type, whether authoritarian or democratic, still poses a range of future challenges for Chinese social organizations. We can suggest that the authoritarian nature of Ethiopia's political system is unlikely to pose a major, significant advantage for Chinese social organizations, especially because since 2009, Ethiopia has a proclamation for the registration and regulation of charities and societies. This is ironic given that the Chinese state is drafting and has continued to instill certain regulations in a very similar fashion as the Ethiopian version. In Malawi, we see challenges of a different kind. It's a young democracy and has presented social organizations the opportunities to assume the role of a watchdog, especially a watchdog of government. And they've played an important role in the process of consolidating Malawi's democracy. Thus, Chinese social organizations may have to contend with issues including governance, accountability, and transparency. The value placed on a democratic governance structure, both at the political level and for social organizations, can be an institutional and regulatory challenge for Chinese social organizations seeking to prosper in Malawi. In short, a nation's political regime type can potentially present either an opportunity or a constraint for Chinese social organizations going out. There are also theoretical implications for the going out of Chinese social organizations. Primary among this is the idea that the internationalization of Gongos represent a varying path, or a fourth operational model which we can call the Shi'ist tradition. The Shi'ist tradition, which is named after Xi Jinping, the current political leader in China, exploits the often opaque distinction between Gongo and state. This exploitation is perhaps most noted in Chinese Gongos' participation in the United Nations, where they have received observer or consultative status. While such practices are not unique to China, we can argue that such acts are manipulating the system, where the space ought to be reserved for traditional, independent civil society groups. It is often the case that when a Chinese Gongo is invited to give evidence, advice, or testimony to international organizations, there's a potential hypocrisy that the Chinese Congo is actually representing the Chinese government's view through the prism of its organization. Or take the example of a Chinese Congo operating in African states under the auspices of a civil society actor conducting developmental work with local beneficiaries. In this scenario, is state sovereignty infringed given the close links between the Congo and an external state's government? While the Wilsonian tradition sidesteps questions of sovereignty infringement, the Congo, which is operationally similar to the state, does possess a closer degree of non-separation, which can be exploited by a state to its global strategic advantage. This advantage may take the form of more expedient actions as engagement occurs between state and semi-state actors. What is clear is that China's internationalization efforts will continue to progress in the 2020s. There will definitely be a great effects in terms of international development theory, in terms of international affairs practices, with China's increasing presence globally. This concludes our lecture on internationalization and its effects. In our next lecture, we'll turn our attention to foreign relations.